Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good, good. I love it. I love it. I love it. I feel it. So, as Kaylee said, I'm going to get a little bit into uh, what the practice of Sabbath looks like for us as Christians. And to kind of give a picture of this, I'm going to start with a story. Kind of forewarning, this is not going to be a very fun story, but it is relevant to what we're talking about. So, when I entered high school, my mom remarried to another man for the first time, and this man became my first stepfather. And all in all, I quite liked him. I found him to be cool, and at the time, I had aspirations like my father and my mother to join the military, and this man was a veteran, and so I would hear a lot of stories about his time serving in Iraq and the things that he experienced while he was in the army. And he experienced some pretty terrible things. Now, at the time, I didn't know it, but my stepfather was slowly deteriorating. I noticed that he drank, but over the next 2 years or so, his kind of avid drinking would progress to full blown alcoholism. He wouldn't work eventually, and he would refuse to go get help. And during this time, my mom started to go back to school, and eventually she went back to school full time. So during this time, it was a really hard time for us as a family financially, and the situation was kind of exacerbated by my stepfather's addiction. Now, my stepdad may not have worked, but the man never rested, tortured by the survivor's guilt of what he experienced in Iraq. The alcohol was just a distraction, an attempt to rid himself of the pain. And I say he refused to work. I know like the disease of addiction makes working like impossible sometimes. But for my stepfather, there was just no rest in his not working. Just pain and the pain that would result from him trying to numb himself from it. In a way, it was more exhausting than any job that he could have ever worked. It was a never ending cycle where it just became harder and harder for him to live any sort of life. Now, I tell this story because it's an extreme example of what the rhythm of work and rest often looks like for us as humans. I'm sure many of you could recall your parents working long hours to the point where you almost never saw them, or your parents coming home from a hard day of work and immediately set themselves in front of the TV, bringing to themselves some kind of false sense of rest and relaxation. Others of you may have had similar stories to mine where you saw a parent or a guardian trying to find comfort in the cycle of addiction or other false comfort things. The reality is that both of these extremes, whether extreme work or extreme false rest, don't work because they're not ultimately how God designed us. God has built into the very fabric of creation a rhythm of working and to cease from working. The ancient Israelites, when they were under the tyranny of Pharaoh, they were driven to work and work until their deaths. There was no sense of rest or Sabbath for them. And when God finally delivered them, he said, hey, that's not going to be how you guys live anymore. I'm putting an end to that. The endless toil that you had known under the oppression of Pharaoh and the Egyptians is no more. Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15, we see God communicate their new reality. He commands them, observe the Sabbath day, to keep it holy or set apart, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And I say this is him communicating this new reality, but the truth is, this is how God created us and his world to be. We have in our imprint the rhythm of work and rest. In Genesis 1, we see God create the world in 6 days, and then rest on the seventh day, man is supposed to work with God to cultivate and care for creation, and then rest with him and delight in him and what he has given them. It's written into the very fabric in our world, but now we live in a sinful world where we have overseers that often demand that we work beyond this rhythm. We have a culture that may not conform to working beyond this rhythm, but instead decide that work is something that is not necessary, or there's some sense of hedonistic rest that we can implant in ourselves that may not in reality be rest at all. And in both cases, true rest as God, as God has designed, often escapes us. So today we're going to talk about the practice of Sabbath and why it's so important for us today. We're going to talk about our relationship to it as Christians in a post-resurrection faith. We're going to talk about why it's important to practice Sabbath and why it is so life-giving. And lastly, we're going to talk about how we can Sabbath. We're going to get into some real examples, not only as individuals, but as a church and as a community. This is a practice that often gets overlooked, but it's important to our formation into people like Jesus. So with that said, let's get started and talk about the idea of the 9 commandments. So, as Christians, our relationship to the Sabbath day it's kind of tricky. It's one of those things where Paul has talked a whole lot about us as believers in Jesus as the Messiah and as God, and how the law was given for a very specific purpose, and in Jesus, all of that has been fulfilled, and so our relationship to it changes. And so Paul often talks about circumcision and food laws and how these are not necessary for a person to find salvation in Jesus. But when it comes to the Sabbath day, Paul is largely silent on this subject of our relationship to it. And the reason for this is I believe that for the church, the Sabbath day and Sunday as a worship day were ultimately synonymous. Like, they didn't practice it on the same day as many of their Jewish brothers and sisters, but the attitude of communal worship and resting and delighting in the Lord was still a reality for them on this day of worship to the Lord. But as the church began to kind of steadily separate itself from its roots in Judaism, and also we start to get more and more into our modern age, the idea of the Sabbath tends to get away from us. On the one spectrum, you have people like our Seventh-day Adventist friends or our friends in the Hebrew Israelite community, where Sabbath must be practiced on Saturday, and it's very rigid, and it must be practiced on this day as it is written in the law. And then we have the other side of it, where we just kind of don't think of Sabbath at all, and it's not really a concept that sticks with us. So think about it. Out of all the parts of the law, like the 10 Commandments, like I said 9 commandments as like a joke, but like the 10 Commandments is a thing that we often cite as things that as Christians absolutely for sure still applies to us. And like we start going through it and we're like, yeah, we shouldn't murder people, obviously. We shouldn't covet the things that our neighbors have. We shouldn't cheat on our spouses. We shouldn't steal. We shouldn't do these things. Practice the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Maybe not. Like we don't really know what to do with it. And so like we may come here and we worship on Sunday, but do we practice Sabbath as it's supposed to be in its original intention? That we cease from working, even thinking about work, and we rest in the light in God? I think most of us would probably say no. And so ultimately that question of whether Sabbath is a binding command today as us for Christians or isn't is ultimately kind of a moot point. The reason being, and the question that we probably should be asking is the Sabbath good for us? And does Sabbath glorify the Lord? And if yes, then binding command or not, we should make a practice of it and see the kind of life and formation into more like the person of Jesus it can make us into. And so with that said, we now start getting into why we should practice the Sabbath. And so the Hebrew word Shabbat, which is where we get the word Sabbath from, is translated into 4 different contexts. stop, rest, delight, and worship. And we're going to go through all of these. So the first one, to stop, that kind of rhythm of creation. As I said earlier, God imprinted in our very nature the creation, into creation, the rhythm of working and then stopping from work. To cease completely from work and everything having to do with it on the Sabbath day. So what does this mean? It doesn't mean just ceasing from our 9 to 5, like, all of us, we often get 2 days off in our jobs. Maybe not all of us do, but some of us do. It means also that we cease from our housework, we cease from our errands, and all the things that you have to do in a given week, we cease from that. And this may be a difficult thing. I mean, some of us have jobs that allow work to stay at work, and some of us don't have jobs like that. Some of us have jobs where work often follows us home, but we are also to cease from working. Kids and teens, I know we often get into our homework and our projects and all those things on the weekend, but you too are to cease from work. And this isn't a religious obligation. It isn't so we can get into some type of religious minutia. This is a gift given to us from God in our very spirits, that we cease from our work and we look up at what is around us. But we can't look up if we don't stop, and stop completely. This isn't just a gift for those of us with disposable income, or those of us who have work from home jobs, or we don't have to be out and about. It is a gift offered to every single person in the kingdom of God, whether the work is done or not. And that's when it gets a little bit hard. God didn't tell the Israelites, hey, it's 6 days you shall labor, and if you get all of your work done, then you can have this day of rest. No, he said 6 days you shall do your work, and then on the seventh day you shall rest. This isn't an earned day of rest or a command into religious tedium. It is a gift from God that is inviting us to stop and look around at what he did as he did when he created the universe. Now, this sounds like it would be a little bit hard. It's because it is. It is very hard. I mean, for some of us, if the work is not done, it bothers us deeply. I get it. One of the things that I do every single night is one of the things that I hate is waking up in the morning, seeing that dishes are still in the sink, and seeing that the kitchen has still not been cleaned. So I clean the kitchen every single night because I hate waking up to that. I have to work and I have to not work really hard, but it takes a bit of trusting the Lord that these things are going to be okay if I don't do them for a day. So for my family and I, to kind of counteract this, we practice our Sabbath on Saturday. And so Friday is kind of a Sabbath prep day for us. That is the day, I had that day off, and Dom kind of sort of has that day off. And so that is the day where we try to do our house cleaning, where we try to get our extant errands done, where we try to, if there's any leftover appointments or anything we have to do, where we try to just kind of get all that done. And so we prep for the Sabbath. Now, did we do this perfectly? No, not at all. Did we get every single thing done? Most of the time, no. There's still 1 or 2 things that are left to be done. Sometimes there's a lot of things that are left to be done. And so when our Sabbath begins, we begin it by writing down all the things that we need to let go of, basically. All the undone work, all of the things that are still bothering us, all the things that are going on with our family and our friends that are just clogging our minds, all the things going on in the world that are giving us worry. We write those things down, and Dom and I discuss it with each other, and we offer these things up to God, and we let them go. We realize that, hey, the world is still going to spin, and it's not going to explode if we stop doing these things or thinking about these things for a day. And remember, guys, this isn't rigid. Jesus talks about this with the Pharisees a lot. If there's something that you absolutely have to get done on your Sabbath, do it. It's not if this is an extreme example, but if Dom and Remy are out on the Sabbath, they're having some time to themselves, and they get a flat tire or something, and they call me saying, Paul, can you come get us? And I'm like, you mean I would, but it's the Sabbath, so I'll see y'all tomorrow. Like, no. Like, if there's something that you absolutely have to do, please go get it done. But please stop. Cease from the work. Cease from all the things we have to do. It's hard, but as a practice, making a practice of stopping is so important. Because oftentimes, like, we're going and going and going, and the Lord often forces us to stop. We just kind of keep going, and we're going, and we just kind of collapse. But when we make a practice of just stopping and looking around us and just seeing what's around us, that is a whole different kind of transformation, and it invites us into rest. So how do we rest on the Sabbath day? Because surely this is more than just catching up on sleep or binging the latest season of Love is Blind or whatever. And it's difficult because as human beings, there are a multitude of things that give us restlessness. And I talked about this in Stop. I talked about this earlier about, my stepfather's PTSD and how that prevented him from experiencing rest even as he didn't work. There are a multitude of things that can give us restlessness. Our unpaid bills are not having the means to do so. Our unmet desires for any form of kind of need, whether relationally or otherwise. The 24-hour news cycles and all the just chaos and nonsense that is going on in the world. Even just the constant knowledge of our phones being on and knowing that there might be something that we see. Even something as simple as our unmet desires manipulated and driven by advertisements on TV and the internet can prevent rest. Therefore, the day of Sabbath is an invitation to let go of all of that and to find our rest in Jesus, to be present where we are without worrying for the future or dredging up the past. To come to Jesus to find healing in our pain, to let go of our unmet desires and to find satisfaction in Him. Jesus' famous saying speaks to this in Matthew 11, 28 through 30. He says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So when we decide to stop and surrender our restlessness to Jesus, we resist the forces that want to keep us in a cycle of desire and craving. We resist against the enemy that doesn't want us to receive healing from our pain. We war against the forces of greed that don't want us to be satisfied with what we have. We take a stand against our own human tendencies that can't stop until it is all done, not realizing that in our world, it isn't done, and it's never going to be done. And that's why Sabbath is so important. We can keep saying I want to get it done, I want to get it done. It never ends. And so God is inviting us to just stop and to find rest in Him. And lastly, when we do this, we look forward to the rest that God is ultimately going to bring us when He returns and restores this world. We look forward to when God totally frees us from all of our restlessness and brings us back to the rest of Eden. Revelation shows us a picture of this future reality that I want to share with you. Revelation 22, 1 through 5 states, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and from the Lamb. Through the middle of the street of the city also, on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and His servants will worship Him. They will see His face, and His name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. There will be no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever." So if you're hearing all this and a little bit of resistance is kind of coming, trust me, it was when I first started practicing Sabbath. If you find resistance to this when you begin practicing Sabbath, one of the things that I suggest is to just do a complete digital fast. Disconnect from the internet, your email, your social media apps, and so on. Disconnect the shopping apps, and try not to spend money unless it's something you need or for something for you to delight in, which we will get to. Discern what will be needed for you to remove the barriers to rest and remove that restlessness as much as possible. Sabbath is a chance for us to look at the pharaohs of our world, and often the pharaohs that reside in our very heart, and say that we will find our rest in God. And when we find that rest in God, we can look forward to delighting. Now, it's funny, the Bible study that's led by Andrew Doss, me and another guy that goes here named Chris, we were talking about the Sabbath, and one of the things that Chris brought up was him kind of, the perception you kind of had of Sabbath as, you read your Bible and sing songs of worship all day, and that's kind of what the Sabbath is. But delight, when we see Sabbath as delight, that's a part of it, but that's not all there is to it. So when we say stop and rest, that's what not to do on the Sabbath to achieve those. But the next two are, but these, delight and worship, are what to do on the Sabbath. When God rests on the seventh day, he looks at his creation and he's delighted in it. He's delighted in the good things that he's created. He delights in humanity, which he says is very good. And so on the Sabbath, we're supposed to spend time delighting in the Lord. We're supposed to spend time delighting in his creation and the things that he has given us. It's a time to reflect on what he has done over the past week and find delight in that. It's a time to do the things that we may be too busy or too exhausted or too distracted to do in a given week. Like when I first started practicing Sabbath, my Sabbath was 4 hours long. Remy, our son Remy, was like a month and a half old. Having a whole day to Sabbath, it wasn't happening. Like it just wasn't going to happen. And so in these 4 hours, what I would do is I would take my Bible and a poetry book, and I would take it to Sweetwater's Coffee over on Shire. That's my favorite coffee shop. And I would order my favorite coffee and a pastry, and then I would just spend time delighting in God and his word and slowing down and journaling. And then I would spend some time reading poetry. And if I felt inspired, I would even maybe write some poetry. In this short 4 hours, it was something like delightful and restful that I had that would have been something much more restful than if I had just spent hours on YouTube or playing some mindless video game all day. It was an intentional kind of rest where I delighted in the Lord, something that he has given, the ability of man to use words to create short and concise, beautiful bodies of writing. So whether you're Sabbath for 4 hours or you Sabbath for a whole day, spend time delighting in the Lord. Just give you some examples, put on a movie that you love and maybe invite some friends over. Take your family or go by yourself and walk through a trail or a nature reserve or something. Get together with other people who are practicing Sabbath and tell stories and read scripture. Enjoy a cup of hot tea on the porch. I don't know, something that you find delightful. Whether by yourself or involving some people that you love. This world has enough trouble and pain in it. This gift of delight should be used to its fullest. No matter who you are, if you find something that you delight in, if you find something that you find joy in the Lord, find joy in that thing. And as you delight, let's respond in worship. So the Sabbath is a day set apart. It's a holy day to the Lord. This word holy means it's more than just, moral goodness. It's just means set aside for a very specific purpose, just like we may set aside specific foods for a given holiday, or set aside specific utensils or plateware for a specific thing. We set apart the Sabbath as a day of stopping, resting, delighting, and worshiping. But wait, don't we already do that? Isn't it called Sunday morning? I mean, yeah, and notice how I called it Sunday morning. See, the Sabbath and Sunday, as I said, used to be synonymous in the Christian church, but nowadays, Sunday has been seen as a time to give our mornings and maybe a little bit of our afternoons to the Lord, but the rest of the day, we're watching the game, or we're doing homework, or we're doing laundry, or we're getting a head start on the work week, we're lesson planning, or whatever we may be doing. While that's not bad, it's kind of like a watered down version of Sabbath. It's kind of like a pseudo Sabbath that ends up not being a Sabbath at all. There's a reason God says to cease all work on the Sabbath. It's so that we can orient our whole selves towards Him. Yes, we should be worshiping and communing with the Lord every single day of the week, but the Sabbath is a day where we're free from work, we're free from the distractions that so often consume our time, and we can look up and we can delight in the things around us, and we can respond to God in worship for who He is and the things that He has given us. You know, wonderful friends and family and spouses and food and the trees and the grass and whatever the things that we may take for granted every day of the week. The Sabbath is a day to notice those things and to notice that God has given us those things. Worship is a response to the goodness of who God is and what He has done, and the Sabbath is an opportunity, just without the distractions and the minutiae of daily life, to praise God for all of that. I can't tell you, just yesterday we were having our Sabbath, and I took Remy on a walk around our apartment complex. And I take Remy on walks like a couple of days a week, so it's not like this is like a rare thing that we rarely get to do. But my phone was on Do Not Disturb, and it was a little easier to not think about all the things that had happened that week and all the things that were coming up. And I just had this little moment where Remy was just running through the grass, and I noticed that a moth was flying next to him. It's such a small thing, but it's those kind of things that I often don't notice when my brain is filled with the things that I still got to do and the things that I still got to pay, and we're falling short on our budget this month, or this thing is going on in my family, or this thing is going on with this friend. And I often find myself so much in my head that I don't notice the things that are going on around my son all the time. And so on the Sabbath, I look up and I'm much more grateful for my wife and my son, and for the trees and for the breeze and for my friends and for a good video game or whatever the case may be, or a poem. The things that so often escape me, the Sabbath is a time for me to remember with my whole self who God is and what He has done. And in this, I go into the week with a renewed sense of joy of what the Sabbath has given me, knowing that, I'm about to probably have an exhausting week, but this is such an intentional rest that I'm going into the week not as much with dread. All of us, still feel, and all of us maybe remember, we get on Sunday, and we're like, school's tomorrow, work is tomorrow, and we have this, really, sense of dread, and just knowing that we got to do this thing that we may want to do. But when we intentionally just slow down and rest, sure, those things may still annoy us. Sure, we might not still enjoy going to work, but maybe it might just give us a little bit of a renewed sense of appreciation for the things that God has given us, and we can go in with a little renewed sense of joy back into the minutiae of daily life. So the Sabbath should consist of all these things: stopping, worshiping, resting, and delighting. If it's going to be a discipline that draws us closer to Jesus and makes us more like Him. If we stop and rest without delighting and worshiping, then it's just another self-care day absent of God's presence. Now, all of this sounds well and good. Yeah, as a concept, it sounds amazing. But how do we get from Sabbath as a concept to Sabbath as a reality? And also, what about when and for whom Sabbath is hard, or maybe even impossible? So let's look at our first thing, but maybe start slow with the Sabbath. Because some of us may be thinking right now, hey, I would love the Sabbath, but I don't have a whole day. My job is too demanding, there's too much going on. I can't give it a whole day. That's fine. If you can't give it a whole day at first, start slow. Remember, I said when I first started, my Sabbath was 4 hours. So maybe start with 4 hours. Maybe start with 6 hours or 8 hours. Now, if you can start with a whole day, I would recommend you try it. But if you can't start with a whole day, just start with that short amount of time. Because I guarantee you those 2, 4, 6, 8 hours of very intentional rest will be much more restful than any kind of pseudo rest we could have, even a whole weekend at that. So if you can't immediately just go into it, start slow. Start with just a couple hours and intentionally plan what you're going to do to stop and rest and delight and worship. Be intentional about it. And then eventually, if you can get to a day, if your situation changes and you can get to a day, or something happens, what I talk about that I might talk about, that I not might talk about, that I will talk about later, like is able to help you get to a day, then do it. But start with something. Even if you have to start slow, start with something. Next, and this is so important, please do not Sabbath alone. Sabbath in community. The Sabbath was designed to be practiced in community. Remember that verse we read in Deuteronomy. Not just the nation of Israel God commanded to practice the Sabbath, but literally all their servants, all their animals, the people who weren't even Israelites or who even loved the Lord, like that were living in their land, all of them were to practice Sabbath. And so Sabbath is meant to be practiced in community with other people, and that means other people who are also trying to intentionally practice Sabbath. And it doesn't matter who you are, this isn't just for married couples spending time with their spouses and your kids, whether you're married or you're single or you're younger or you're older, like practice Sabbath in community and get together with some people. So when Dom and I first started practicing Sabbath, we did so in a little community of ourselves. So Dom and I, Morgan Matei, Andrew Doss, and the Bocondas would gather for dinner. For some of us, it was the end of our Sabbath, and for others, it was the beginning of their Sabbath. And we'd have a little potluck, and we just get together and we talk about what God was doing in our lives through the Sabbath, and we'd laugh and we'd talk about what was going on, and we talk about conspiracy theories and just I don't know how those conversations got there, but they just do. And just overall delight in each other's presence. The Sabbath is meant to be practiced in community. So my challenge is for you, if you hear this and you want to try to practice Sabbath, find some other people who also want to try to practice Sabbath. Maybe get together with your Connect groups and say, hey, we want to try and practice Sabbath, and we want to make a point of our Connect groups to Sabbath together. Also, our Sabbath, our Saturday nights, it's an open invitation for us from Dom and I. If any of you want to start practicing Sabbath, you're welcome to come join us and have dinner with us and practice Sabbath with us in this community. So get together, have a meal celebration, tell a story from the Bible, share a dessert, laugh, cry, release, but don't do it alone. No matter who you are, what your life situation is, or what your marital status is, or how old or young you are, delight in God and practice the Sabbath. Now, I want to address 2 rebuttals to practicing Sabbath. So, for example, how do we practice Sabbath for those who don't own their time? Because all of this sounds great, but the reality is not everyone has full ownership of their time. Some of us are in high-demand jobs. We're working 60 to 80 hours a week. Some of us may be working several jobs just to try and make ends meet. Some of us might be caring for very young babies where it's just a struggle to get 1 to 2 hours of sleep a night. Other of us may be caring for adult family members on top of working. Some of us may be teachers where the work just often follows us home all the time, and it's hard to turn it off. So the truth of the matter is, some of us do have this time to practice Sabbath, but not all of us do. So what can we do? Well, aside from starting the Sabbath slow and Sabbathing with whatever you can spare, I think there are 2 things we can do. First, we as a community, we can try to create Sabbath for those who can't. So if any of us find ourselves not being able to have Sabbath, how can we who do create Sabbath for those who cannot? Can we watch the kids or the babies for our single parents or those who have little infants? Can we pull our resources together to help cover bills for those who are just working endlessly just to make ends meet. If we have any teachers in here that can practice Sabbath, is there wisdom or help that we can give to our teachers who are struggling to find the time for it? This is one of the reasons why practicing Sabbath in community is so important. Because unlike Israel, where their whole nation practiced Sabbath and it was built into their national DNA, that isn't the reality for us who live here in America. We're in the endless hamster wheel of capitalism, and we may just not have time for it. So that's the time for us as a community to help and surround each other. And I wish I could give us more concrete examples. And hopefully, honestly, if more of us start practicing Sabbath, like we can start thinking of more concrete examples of how we can help create Sabbath for those who just cannot have it. Secondly, I want to touch on one other objection. Practicing Sabbath when there's nothing to delight in. For some of us, or maybe even a lot of us, our work or our distractions may be a big part of our life. Other of us might seem to be struggling with the seemingly endless weight of depression, or self-medicating to distract from the pain of our past. What if we're afraid that when we stop and rest, we look up and there's nothing to delight in? Nothing to offer worship up to God for, no family or friends or good things. And I hear you. And I want you to listen very closely to what I'm saying. I want to say that that is a good thing. Why? Because it means that the Lord in his graciousness is helping you to look up to see that something is not right. That's not a punishment, it's a mercy. I wish my stepfather would have looked up and realized that his life had spiraled out of control and that he needed help. If you're afraid that there would be nothing to delight in, or you would stop and think that there's nothing to delight in, like you would know that if I stopped, there isn't going to be anything to delight in. Come talk to somebody. Go, I'm pleading with you, go get help. Surrender that realization up to God. The only one who wants to keep you from stopping and realizing something is wrong is the enemy. Because then he has continued free reign to wreak havoc in our lives. So if you're afraid that you'll have that realization, or you know that you'll have that realization, go seek help. Come talk to us. We want to point you to that Sabbath rest that you can have. We want you to be able to walk into that freedom from that toiling that Jesus has won for you on the cross. Walk into the rest that Jesus has not only promised you, but is paid for. So don't stay trapped in the endless toil. Don't stay trapped in the numbness. Don't stay trapped in the distractions or whatever it is. Stop, rest, and delight, and offer up worship to God. And if you think that there will be nothing to delight in, come talk to us. We're here. That's why we're gathering in here every Sunday. It's not to fulfill some religious obligation, or not just to sing songs of worship or to hear one of us talk to you for 30 to 45 minutes. That's a part of it. But we're here to help each other, to lift one another up, to pray for each other that we can receive healing. Don't do this alone. Practice the Sabbath. Rest, but don't do this alone. And if you're afraid that there will be nothing to delight in, come talk to us. We want to point you to help. We want to help you get help. So no matter what the relationship to the Sabbath we as Christians in a post-resurrection faith have, the truth of the matter is, it is good for us. It's one of the many ways that we can do as Jesus did and become like him, to stop, to truly rest, to wake up, and to notice the things around us, to delight in and offer up worship to God for them. Because the truth is that we often have things to delight in, but whatever it is, either the distractions or our work or our pain, we often don't see them and we often don't acknowledge them. So this is an invitation. It's not a requirement for salvation. It's not anything like that. This is an invitation into beginning to practice Sabbath as it is meant to be practiced. That being said, I hope you take time to consider what it could look like for you. I hope you find people to practice with. And if you're struggling to find people to practice with, come talk to me. I want to practice Sabbath with you. I pray that it would form all of us into looking more like Jesus. And with that, we close our looks we close our look into God's word and we enter the sacred space of the communion table.